Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Guardian Angel.
It started subtly. I was a young professional living in Seattle, and my life was pretty routine, commuting to work, meeting friends, grabbing coffee. But then I began to notice something strange, a persistent sensation like being watched. It was so faint at first, just a shiver down my spine when I was alone in a crowd or a sudden chill on a warm day. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to stress or an overactive imagination. But as the days went by, the feeling grew more pronounced. I started to sense that I was never truly alone, no matter where I went. Whether I was walking to work through the busy streets or sitting in my favorite coffee shop, I felt an unseen presence following me. It wasn't just a fleeting sensation, it was a constant, gnawing awareness that someone, or something, was observing me. Sometimes, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. It was always just a shadow, a flicker of movement, but there was never anyone in sight. My heart would race, and I would quickly try to rationalize it as paranoia or an illusion. Yet, the feeling never went away. The more I tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to intensify, like a silent observer that refused to be dismissed. The sensation of being watched grew more intense, consuming my every thought. My once orderly life became a web of paranoia and obsession. I started altering my routine in a desperate attempt to catch whoever, or whatever, was following me. I took different routes to work, varying my departure times, and even began avoiding places I frequented. But no matter what I did, the feeling persisted. Determined to find some answers, I set up hidden cameras around my apartment. I was meticulous, placing them in every corner, hoping to capture any sign of the presence that plagued me. Each night, I would sit for hours, replaying the footage, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. One evening, as I was sifting through the recordings, something chilling caught my eye. In the corner of the screen, just outside the frame of my front door, there was a shadowy figure. It was never fully visible, always lingering at the edge of my vision. The figure moved in sync with my own movements, a ghostly presence that seemed to flit in and out of view. My heart pounded as I rewound the footage, watching the shadow shift and distort with every frame. It was never clear or distinct, always a dark shape on the periphery. But the fact that it was there, consistently tracking my movements, was enough to send chills down my spine. I couldn't ignore it any longer. This was no mere coincidence. The figure was real, and it was watching me, always lurking just out of sight. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to confront the presence directly. It was a late night, the streets of Seattle eerily quiet, and I took to walking around my neighborhood, hoping to catch a glimpse of my elusive stalker. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional distant siren or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I wandered for hours, the darkness swallowing my footsteps, but the figure remained elusive. My search felt futile until I stumbled upon an old, abandoned building on the outskirts of the city. It was a decrepit structure, clearly forgotten by time, with boarded-up windows and an overgrown yard. It was the only place I hadn't explored, and a gut feeling urged me to investigate. With trepidation, I pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The building was a maze of dust-covered furniture and broken windows, an unsettling quiet pervading the air. I moved cautiously through the rooms, my flashlight cutting through the gloom, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. Eventually, I found a room that made my blood run cold. It was cluttered with old surveillance equipment, large monitors, tangled cables, and dusty cameras. My heart raced as I approached the setup. The monitors were all connected to cameras placed around my apartment. The screens displayed live feeds of my home, showing every corner, every room. The footage was grainy and distorted, but there was no mistaking it. These were the same angles and views I had seen on my own security cameras. It was as if someone had been watching my every move, tracking me with meticulous detail. The revelation hit me hard, a wave of terror crashing over me. The figure was not just a shadow, it was someone with a detailed, sinister interest in my life. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically searched through the room. Every creak of the floorboards and rustle of old papers seemed amplified in the oppressive silence. My flashlight beam swept across the clutter, revealing scattered documents and dusty remnants of the past. Then, buried beneath a pile of old newspapers, I found a journal. The leather cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age. With trembling hands, I opened it. The entries detailed my daily routines, my habits, and my movements with unnerving precision. It became glaringly obvious that someone had been obsessively watching me for weeks, documenting every action, every mundane detail of my life. But as disturbing as that was, it wasn't the worst part. Flipping through the pages, I found sketches of a figure, distorted and grotesque, with hollow, soulless eyes. The drawings were crude but haunting, capturing an inhuman face that seemed to leer from the pages. Alongside the sketches were unsettling notes about my reactions, my fears, and my vulnerabilities. The entries described a twisted fascination with my terror, an enjoyment in tracking my every move. The chilling realization struck me like a cold wave. My guardian angel was not a protector but a predator who reveled in my fear. This was no benign presence. It was a malevolent force that thrived on my anxiety and distress. The sense of security I once had was shattered, replaced by a bone-deep fear of what might come next. Panic surged through me as I fled the abandoned building, my mind a whirlwind of terror and disbelief. The oppressive feeling of being watched intensified with each step I took toward my apartment. I could almost feel the presence closing in, a chilling certainty that my stalker was aware of my discovery. When I finally reached home, my heart sank at the sight that greeted me. The door was ajar, and my once orderly apartment was in utter disarray. Drawers were yanked open, their contents strewn across the floor. Personal belongings, photographs, letters, and clothes were scattered in chaotic piles. The sense of violation was overwhelming. My eyes were drawn to the bed, where a note lay waiting. I approached it with a sinking dread. The note was written in a shaky, uneven hand, its words scrawled hastily. "You've been a good subject. Now, let's see how you handle the final test." As my eyes moved over the message, a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I could feel the weight of every second ticking by, knowing that the true horror was just beginning. The noise from the shadows behind me made my breath catch in my throat. It was a faint rustling, like someone, or something, moving cautiously. I turned around slowly, every fiber of my being screaming at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the floor. The darkness seemed to thicken, and a shape began to emerge from the shadows, just at the edge of my vision. My heart pounded in my chest as I faced the encroaching darkness, fully aware that whatever had been watching me was now closing in, ready to turn my worst fears into reality.
The House Fairy.
It was supposed to be a fresh start. My family and I had just moved into a charming old house in Portland, Oregon, filled with character and history. We were excited about the new chapter in our lives, eager to put down roots in this quiet neighborhood. The house, with its creaky wooden floors and ivy-clad exterior, seemed perfect for us. The first few days were filled with the usual chaos of unpacking and settling in. Boxes were stacked high in every room, and the air was thick with the smell of paint and dust. It was during this whirlwind of activity that we first discovered the odd little gifts. I remember finding the first one while unpacking dishes in the kitchen. Tucked between some plates was an old-fashioned locket, delicate and tarnished, with an inscription on the back, "Welcome home." It struck me as peculiar but not alarming. I assumed it was a kind gesture from a previous owner or perhaps a quirky neighborhood tradition. As the days went on, we found more of these mysterious gifts. A vintage key left on the mantel, a set of old coins hidden in a drawer, and handwritten notes with cryptic messages like, "Hope you're enjoying your stay." At first, we thought it was just a friendly prank from a neighbor, something to welcome us to the area. It seemed harmless enough. However, the notes and gifts were becoming more frequent, and each one was more puzzling than the last. My husband, Mark, and I joked about having a house fairy who was obsessed with making us feel welcome. The kids, Emma and Jake, were intrigued by the little treasures, but as time went on, the feeling of unease started to creep in. One evening, as I was tidying up the living room, I found a new note tucked beneath a vase. It read, "I see you." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced around the room, but there was no sign of anyone. I brushed it off as a misplaced joke or an overactive imagination, but the seed of unease had been planted. The gifts and notes continued, each one slightly more unsettling than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us, leaving these tokens as part of a game, or something much darker. The excitement of our new home began to give way to an unsettling dread, and I found myself wondering what kind of welcome we had really received. As the days passed, the novelty of the strange gifts wore off, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The items we found were no longer whimsical or charming. Instead, they grew darker and more disturbing. One morning, Emma found a broken doll left in the hallway, its glassy eyes staring vacantly at us. The doll was missing an arm, and its once bright dress was stained and torn. We tried to laugh it off as a twisted joke, but the sight of it left us uneasy. The next day, Jake discovered a used bandage tucked into the back of a closet. It was stained with something dark, and the smell made me feel nauseous. The notes accompanying these items had changed too. Where once they had been cryptic but benign, they now carried an unsettling edge. One note read, "Isn't it fun to play house?" while another simply said, "I'm watching you." Each note was written in the same shaky handwriting, and the messages seemed to become more personal, mentioning specifics about our routines and habits. The mounting sense of paranoia pushed us into action. We needed answers. Mark and I decided to dig into the history of the house, hoping to uncover any secrets that might explain the increasingly bizarre occurrences. We started by speaking with our neighbors, hoping to find someone who could shed light on the previous occupants. To our surprise, most of the neighbors were either unhelpful or evasive. They knew little about the house's history and seemed strangely disinterested in our concerns. One elderly woman, Mrs. Peterson, gave us a fleetingly unsettling comment. She mentioned, almost in passing, that the previous owners had left suddenly, but she didn't know why. Her tone was curt, as if she didn't want to discuss it further. We turned to local archives and library records to find more information. The deeper we dug, the more elusive the details became. There were vague references to previous tenants but no concrete information. It was as if the house had a way of erasing its past. The feeling of being watched intensified. I began to notice strange occurrences at home, a light flickering in the hallway, a cold draft where there shouldn't be one. We couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always just out of sight, tracking our every move. The gifts continued to appear, each more disturbing than the last. A blood-stained handkerchief, an old photograph of a family with their faces scratched out, and a note that read, "Your turn is next." The sense of dread grew heavier with each passing day. The house, which had once seemed like a dream home, was slowly becoming a living nightmare. Our attempts to uncover the truth only deepened our fear. The personal nature of the gifts and the increasing frequency of their appearance made it clear that this was no ordinary prank. We were dealing with something far more sinister, and the fear of not knowing who, or what, was behind it was consuming us. Our investigation into the house's history led us down a dark and disturbing path. With each new discovery, the sense of dread in our home grew heavier. We knew we had to uncover more about the previous occupants if we were ever going to understand the twisted gifts we were receiving. I started by combing through old newspaper archives and police reports, hoping to find clues that would explain the bizarre events. The more we dug, the more unsettling the information became. We discovered that the house had once belonged to a family named the Harringtons. According to the articles, the Harringtons had vanished mysteriously about 15 years ago, leaving behind an empty house and a town full of unanswered questions. The police reports were filled with eerie details. The Harringtons had disappeared without a trace, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. The case was eventually labeled as a missing persons case, but no leads ever surfaced. The reports mentioned that the family had a young daughter, Emily, who was never found. The lack of resolution to the case made it all the more chilling. The deeper we delved, the more we found out about the Harringtons. Old articles revealed that they had been a well-respected family, known for their generosity and involvement in the community. But as we pieced together the timeline of their disappearance, we began to notice unsettling gaps and inconsistencies. It was as if someone had deliberately erased parts of their lives. Our fear turned into paranoia as the gifts we received seemed more and more connected to the Harringtons' tragic past. One day, Emma found a tattered toy that matched the description of a doll that had once belonged to Emily Harrington. Another note, left on the kitchen table, read, "She's still here, waiting." The sense of being watched became overwhelming. It felt as though the house itself was taunting us with reminders of its dark history. The once comforting walls now seemed oppressive, filled with whispers of a past we couldn't escape. We could no longer ignore the connection between the gifts and the missing family. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to draw us into their tragic fate. Our anxiety and fear escalated to the point where we began questioning our own sanity. Were we imagining things? Or was there something truly malevolent lurking within the house? The constant feeling of being watched, the disturbing gifts, and the haunting past of the Harringtons combined to create a nightmarish reality. It was clear that our investigation had uncovered only the tip of the iceberg. The house's dark history was bleeding into our present, and we were left with more questions than answers. The connection between the past and our present terror was growing stronger, and the thought that we might be part of a sinister pattern left us paralyzed with fear. The tension in the house reached a breaking point when we received the final gift, one that left us utterly horrified. It arrived on a cold, rainy evening, delivered by an anonymous courier who left it at our front door and disappeared before we could even see their face. Inside the box was a collection of personal items that belonged to each of us. My wedding ring, Emma's favorite childhood toy, Jake's school trophy, and even Mark's old baseball cap were all inside. Each item was wrapped carefully in tissue paper, and alongside them was a note that sent chills down my spine. The note detailed intimate, private moments from our lives. Moments we hadn't shared with anyone outside our family. It spoke of our fears, our arguments, our dreams. It felt like an invasion of our most personal spaces. As we were trying to process the horror of this gift, we heard a noise coming from the attic. The house seemed to creak and groan as if something, or someone, was moving around. Our fear reached a crescendo as we decided to confront whatever was up there. Armed with flashlights and shaking with dread, we climbed the stairs to the attic. The attic was a dusty, cluttered space filled with forgotten belongings and old furniture. As we scanned the room with our flashlights, we saw it, a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadows. It was tall and indistinct, its features obscured by darkness. We could feel an oppressive presence, and the air seemed to grow colder with each passing second. The figure slowly stepped into the light, revealing itself to be an older man with a gaunt face and hollow eyes. He looked at us with an unsettling calmness. As we stood frozen in fear, he began to speak, his voice a raspy whisper. "I see you found my gifts," he said, his eyes glinting with a mix of sorrow and malice. "I am the last of the Harringtons. I was left behind when the others vanished." He explained that he had been obsessed with the house and its dark past. The previous family's disappearance was not just a tragic accident, but a result of his own madness. He had been driven to torment new occupants as a twisted form of revenge, hoping to relive his own pain and guilt. He wanted to ensure that those who lived in the house after him would suffer as he had suffered. The gifts were his way of marking us, making us a part of his torment. He watched us closely, tracking our every move to find new ways to unsettle us. His obsession with the house and its dark history drove him to commit these acts, hoping that we would be consumed by the same fear and paranoia that had plagued him. With a final haunting look, the man retreated into the shadows, leaving us with the weight of his revelation. The house, which had once seemed like a new beginning, was now forever tainted by its dark history. The knowledge that we were part of a cycle of torment and that we had unwittingly become players in this macabre game left us in a state of fear and despair. As we stumbled out of the attic, we knew that our lives had changed irreversibly. The house's sinister legacy had become our own, and the haunting presence of the Harringtons was now a part of our daily reality. Our final confrontation with the tormentor was inevitable. The terror we'd lived through had reached its climax, and we knew we had to face the entity responsible for our suffering. The house, once a symbol of hope, had become a nightmarish prison, and it was time to end this ordeal. That night, we gathered our courage and prepared for the worst. The figure, the last of the Harringtons, had been lurking somewhere in the house, and we felt the oppressive weight of his presence as we moved through the rooms. We confronted him in the dimly lit living room, the place where our journey into fear had begun. He emerged from the shadows, his gaunt face twisted with a mix of rage and sorrow. "You think you can leave?" he hissed, his voice echoing with a haunting resonance. "You think you can escape the past?" The room seemed to close in on us as he revealed his true nature. The man was not just a deranged individual, but a twisted soul bound to the house, forever seeking new victims to torment. His rage was not only fueled by his own suffering, but also by a desire to keep the house's dark legacy alive. His eyes, once hollow and vacant, now blazed with a malevolent fire. We tried to reason with him, to plead for our safety, but he was beyond reason. The house itself seemed to come alive, the walls pulsating with a dark energy. The air grew heavy, and strange noises echoed through the rooms. We were caught in a trap of our own making, unable to escape the fear that gripped us. The final encounter was a surreal and terrifying experience. The man's torment seemed to reflect our deepest fears, manifesting as shadowy figures and nightmarish visions. Each of us faced our own personal horrors, memories twisted into grotesque forms, fears made flesh. The house was a labyrinth of terror, and we were lost in its nightmarish maze. Despite our best efforts to escape, we were ultimately forced to make a choice: leave the house and abandon everything we had, or remain trapped in a never-ending cycle of fear. We chose to leave, knowing that our sanity and safety were at stake. As we fled the house, we had one last, haunting encounter. The man appeared at the front door, his eyes filled with a mixture of fury and sorrow. "You can leave," he said, his voice cold and distant, "but the house will always be a part of you." We left Seattle that night, the house receding into the distance as we drove away. The city lights blurred past us, and the weight of our ordeal began to settle in. The psychological scars of our experience would never fade, and the memories of the house lingered like a shadow over our lives. The house remained behind, its dark secrets untouched and waiting for the next family to come. As for us, we carried the impact of the events with us, the haunting presence of the Harringtons forever etched into our minds. No matter where we went, the fear and paranoia would follow, a constant reminder of the house that had changed our lives forever.
The baby monitor.
When we first moved into the house, I couldn't have been more excited. It was the perfect place to start our little family. A cozy two-story home nestled in a quiet suburb of Seattle, with just the right amount of charm and character. It felt like the kind of place where we could make countless memories, and I was eager to begin our new life here with my husband, David, and our newborn daughter, Lily. Setting up Lily's nursery was my top priority. I wanted it to be perfect, every detail just right for our little girl. The room was painted a soft, calming shade of lavender, with white furniture that gave it a fresh, airy feel. I spent hours arranging and rearranging her crib, the changing table, and a plush rocking chair where I'd spend late nights soothing her back to sleep. One of the last things I installed was the baby monitor. David had insisted we get the best one on the market, a sleek, high-tech device that promised crystal-clear video and sound. I had to admit, it gave me peace of mind knowing I could keep an eye on Lily at all times, even when I wasn't in the room. The monitor was equipped with a night vision feature, motion detection, and even a two-way audio system that allowed me to speak to her from anywhere in the house. The first night we used it, I sat in the living room with the monitor perched on the coffee table in front of me. The screen displayed a perfect view of Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib. I watched her chest rise and fall with each tiny breath, feeling a wave of love and protectiveness wash over me. This was my new life, watching over my daughter, ensuring her safety and happiness. I felt an overwhelming sense of contentment, knowing I could see her every move, even from a distance. As I stared at the screen, mesmerized by the serene image of Lily in her crib, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. Everything was as it should be. Our new home, our beautiful daughter, and this powerful little device that let me keep her in my sight at all times. I couldn't imagine anything disturbing the peace of our perfect little world. But as I would soon learn, some things are meant to remain unseen. It started subtly, so much so that I almost didn't notice it at first. A few nights after setting up the monitor, I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard something strange. It was just a faint noise, barely audible, but enough to jolt me awake. I sat up, listening intently, trying to pinpoint what it was. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the baby monitor on my nightstand. I leaned over to check the monitor. The screen showed Lily, still fast asleep in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically. But then, just as I was about to turn away, I heard it again, a faint whisper, so quiet that I thought I might be imagining it. I stared at the monitor, straining to hear, but the sound had stopped. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a trick of the mind, and went back to bed. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was downstairs in the living room, with the monitor on the coffee table in front of me. I was reading a book, trying to unwind, when I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. The screen flickered for a split second, showing a brief, distorted image. It was too quick to make out, just a flash of static, but it left me feeling uneasy. I dismissed it as a glitch. Maybe the monitor was picking up interference from a nearby device, or the Wi-Fi was acting up. But then I heard the whisper again, this time a bit louder, like someone was murmuring just out of earshot. I froze, staring at the monitor. The screen was back to normal, showing Lily sound asleep, completely unaware of anything unusual. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, just technical issues that would probably resolve themselves. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that whisper, faint but persistent, and the memory of that fleeting, distorted image lingered in my mind. The next few nights were the same: flickers of static on the monitor, faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, and an unsettling sense of unease that I couldn't explain. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. I started paying closer attention to the monitor, watching it more intently, waiting for something to happen. And the more I watched, the more I noticed. The whispers became more frequent, the flickers of static more pronounced. Sometimes, the image on the screen would warp and twist, as if something was interfering with the signal. But every time I checked on Lily, she was perfectly fine, sleeping soundly in her crib. I wanted to believe it was just a technical issue, that there was a simple explanation for everything I was seeing and hearing. But as the days went by, I found it harder and harder to ignore the gnawing feeling of dread that had taken root in my chest. Something was wrong. I just didn't know what it was. I should have trusted my instincts. I should have known that something was wrong. But at first, I kept convincing myself that it was all in my head, that the monitor was just acting up. It was easier to believe that than to face the alternative, that there might be something else in the house with us. The disturbances didn't just continue, they got worse. The flickers on the monitor became more frequent, the whispers louder, clearer. And then, one night, I saw it. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, with the monitor propped up on the counter. I glanced at it absent-mindedly, expecting to see Lily peacefully sleeping as usual. But instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadowy figure on the screen, just barely visible in the dim glow of the night vision. It was tall, almost skeletal, and it was moving, slowly, deliberately, toward Lily's crib. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the screen, unable to look away. The figure seemed to hover over her, its shape shifting and blurring as if it was made of smoke. I rushed up the stairs, my mind racing with fear. When I burst into Lily's room, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. But when I looked at her crib, there was nothing there, no figure, no shadow. Just Lily, sound asleep, completely unaware of the terror I was feeling. I checked the room thoroughly, but there was nothing out of place, nothing to explain what I had seen. I went back to the monitor, hoping that maybe I had just imagined it, that the figure was some kind of glitch or trick of the light. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That figure, whatever it was, had been real. I could feel it. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't ignore it any longer. The next night, the shadow returned. This time, it appeared earlier, while I was still downstairs. I saw it move across the monitor, slow and deliberate, like it was aware that I was watching. The whispers were no longer faint. They were clearer now, and unmistakably human. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was dark, almost threatening. I felt a growing sense of dread every time I turned on the monitor. The shadowy figure would appear more frequently, lingering near Lily's crib, sometimes even hovering directly over her. Each time, I would rush upstairs, only to find her alone, sleeping soundly. It didn't make any sense. How could something so real on the screen vanish without a trace? The images on the monitor became more distorted, more disturbing. Sometimes, it looked like there were multiple figures in the room, their shapes merging and separating like some twisted dance. Other times, the screen would flicker violently, the image twisting into grotesque shapes that made me feel sick to my stomach. I could feel myself unraveling. The more I saw, the more paranoid I became. I started questioning my own sanity, wondering if I was losing my mind. How could this be happening? Was it some kind of sick prank? Or was there really something in the house, something beyond my understanding? Every night, I would sit in front of that monitor, waiting for the shadows to appear, dreading the moment they did. I became obsessed, unable to think about anything else. I could barely sleep, barely eat. All I could do was watch, and wait, and fear for my daughter's safety. But the worst part was the growing sense of helplessness. No matter how many times I checked, no matter how much I watched, I couldn't stop it. The shadowy figure kept coming back, and I was powerless to do anything about it. I was trapped, caught in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, and I didn't know how much more I could take. I couldn't take it anymore. The shadowy figures, the whispers, the growing dread, they were driving me to the brink of madness. I knew I had to do something, anything, to figure out what was happening in my house. I couldn't keep living like this, constantly terrified, feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. I needed answers. So, I decided to dig deeper. I started by researching the house's history. At first, I found nothing unusual, just the typical records of a home that had changed hands a few times over the years. But then, I stumbled upon an old article from the local newspaper, dated over a decade ago. The headline sent a shiver down my spine. Child mysteriously vanishes from local home. Search continues for missing boy. The article described how a little boy, just 3 years old, had disappeared from his bedroom one night, without a trace. The parents had been devastated, and despite an exhaustive search by the police and the community, the boy was never found. There were no signs of a break-in, no evidence of foul play. He had simply vanished. And the house where it happened, it was ours. My heart pounded as I read the details, my mind racing to make sense of it all. The boy's name was Ethan. His parents, the previous owners of the house, had moved away shortly after his disappearance, unable to bear the grief and the lingering questions. The case had gone cold, and the house had changed hands a couple of times since then, but no one had stayed long. I wondered if they, too, had experienced something they couldn't explain. I dug further, combing through old news articles, police reports, anything I could find. The more I read, the more disturbing the story became. There were rumors, whispered among the locals, that the house was cursed. People claimed to have seen strange things, shadows in the windows, strange noises at night, objects moving on their own. Some even believed that Ethan's spirit still lingered in the house, trapped between worlds, searching for a way to come back. The whispers on the monitor, the shadowy figures. Could it be Ethan? Was he trying to communicate, to tell me something? Or was it something darker, something more sinister, pretending to be him? I was terrified, but I couldn't stop. I needed to know the truth, even if it meant facing the unthinkable. I began to look through old records, trying to trace the house's history even further back. That's when I found it, a record of a family that had lived in the house over a century ago. They, too, had lost a child under mysterious circumstances. A little girl who had disappeared one night, never to be seen again. My hands trembled as I pieced it all together. This house, my house, had a dark, tragic history, one that seemed to repeat itself every few decades. Each time, a child had vanished, leaving behind only unanswered questions and broken families. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized the horrifying truth. Whatever was happening now, whatever I was seeing on that monitor, it was connected to these past events. The shadows, the whispers, they weren't just random occurrences. They were echoes of something that had happened before, something that had claimed the lives of innocent children. And now, it was happening again. I felt sick to my stomach, a cold dread settling over me as I stared at the monitor, at the image of Lily sleeping peacefully in her crib. I knew I had to do something, but what? How could I protect her from something I didn't even understand? One thing was certain, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to confront whatever was haunting this house, whatever was trying to reach out to me through the monitor. My daughter's life depended on it. But as I prepared myself for what was to come, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was up against something far more powerful and terrifying than I could ever have imagined. I knew this was my last chance. The fear had consumed me, but my love for Lily was stronger. I couldn't let whatever was haunting this house take her from me. I had to confront it, to fight back, no matter what it took. So, I devised a plan, a desperate, last-ditch effort to protect my daughter and reclaim our home. I spent the day setting up cameras in every room, every hallway, even the basement. I didn't trust the baby monitor anymore. It had become a window into something I could barely comprehend. Instead, I wanted to see everything, to capture whatever was lurking in the shadows. I had to know what I was dealing with. As night fell, I put Lily to bed, my heart heavy with fear. I watched her sleep for a long time, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face and whispering a promise that I would keep her safe. Then, I retreated to the living room, where I had all the camera feeds displayed on my laptop. The monitor sat beside it, like a ticking time bomb I was too afraid to touch. The hours passed slowly. Midnight came and went, and for a while, everything was quiet. The only sound was the soft hum of the electronics and the occasional creak of the old house settling. I felt the tension in my body build, every nerve on edge, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The first sign was a flicker on the monitor, a flash of static that made my heart skip a beat. I leaned forward, staring at the screen as the shadowy figure appeared once again. But this time, it didn't stay in Lily's room. It moved, slowly, deliberately, out of her door and into the hallway. I watched in horror as it crept toward the stairs, its form twisting and shifting like smoke. I quickly checked the camera feeds, my hands shaking. The figure was there, too, barely visible but unmistakable, moving closer to where I was. The whispers started again, louder this time, almost like chanting, a dark, guttural sound that filled me with dread. I knew I couldn't run. Whatever this thing was, it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. I had to face it, to confront it head-on. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was trying to smother me. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw it. The figure was at the bottom, a dark mass of shadow and smoke, its form barely human. It looked up at me, and for the first time, I felt its presence in a way that was almost tangible, a cold, malevolent force that seemed to reach into my soul. The whispers grew louder, more intense, filling my mind with a sense of overwhelming despair. But I couldn't back down. I had to protect Lily. I took a step forward, forcing myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the empty house. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to rise, its shape growing larger, more defined. It was no longer just a shadow. I could see features now, twisted, distorted, as if the thing had once been human but had lost its form over time. Its eyes, or what passed for them, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to draw the light out of the room. And then, I heard it, a voice, clearer than before, emerging from the whispers. "Give back," it rasped, the words barely more than a hiss. Give back. What was taken? I realized then what it meant. The children, the ones who had disappeared from this house, they had been taken by this thing, trapped in some nightmarish limbo. And now, it wanted Lily. It wanted to take her, too, to keep her in its twisted grasp. "No," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "You can't have her. You can't take her." The entity surged forward, and the house seemed to come alive with it. The walls groaned, the floorboards creaked, and the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. I could feel its anger, its desperation, as it tried to push me back, to force me to give in. But I stood my ground, refusing to let it win. In a moment of sheer terror, I pointed the flashlight directly at the figure. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating its ghastly form. It recoiled, its shape distorting and writhing in the light. The whispers turned into a furious roar, a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, their words unintelligible but filled with anger and sorrow. I didn't know what else to do, so I kept the light trained on it, hoping that it would be enough to drive it back. The figure seemed to shrink, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. But just as I thought it might disappear, it surged forward one last time, its form coalescing into something more solid, more real. I braced myself, ready to fight, but then the monitor, forgotten on the floor behind me, came to life with a burst of static. The entity hesitated, its attention drawn to the screen. For a brief moment, I saw a flicker of something, an image, a face, trapped within the static. And then I understood. The entity wasn't just haunting the house. It was trapped within the monitor, bound to it, unable to escape. It had been trying to reach out, to find a way back, but it was stuck, caught in the loop of that cursed device. With a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed the monitor and hurled it down the stairs. It shattered against the floor, the screen going dark with a final burst of static. The entity let out a terrible, inhuman scream, a sound that echoed through the house and rattled the walls. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. The house fell silent. The oppressive weight in the air lifted, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. I collapsed on the floor, my body shaking with fear and exhaustion. It was over. Whatever that thing had been, whatever had haunted this house for so long, it was finally gone. I rushed back to Lily's room, my heart pounding with relief. She was still asleep, safe and sound, completely unaware of the nightmare that had just ended. I picked her up, holding her close, and whispered a promise that I would never let anything harm her again. The next day, we left the house. I didn't care about selling it, about the money we had invested. All I cared about was getting my family far away from that place, from the horrors it had held. We moved in with David's parents while we figured out what to do next. I don't know what became of the house after we left. Part of me doesn't want to know. But I do know this. Some places are haunted, not just by spirits, but by the echoes of past tragedies, by the darkness that lingers long after the events have faded into history. And sometimes, that darkness finds a way to reach out, to try and take something for itself. I'm just grateful that this time, it didn't succeed.